I'm Jack Knott. I'm the Dean of the USC School of Policy, Planning and Development, and on behalf of the school, I welcome you heartily to this special presentation by Dan Siegel. It's great to see so many people here from across the campus, not only from our school, which is a testament, I think, to Dan's reach and breadth of the kind of work he does and the interest people have in him. Before I begin, I want to thank Deborah Natoli for organizing this event and coming up with the idea for it, actually. It was a very creative way to start our semester, and I'm very appreciative of that. And I, of course, want to thank Dan for coming and taking the time and giving this important presentation to us. Before I introduce Deborah, I just wanted to say a little bit about the context. This presentation is part of our orientation for our professional doctoral program in policy planning and development. And it's a very important program to me and very dear to my heart. It's different from our PhD program, in which we're training people to be academics for the most part. With our DPPD program, we have just an amazing group of students who come out of leadership roles in several professions related to our school, and they're interested in gaining critical analytical thinking skills, greater methods training, and also some opportunity to delve more into the literature and reflect on their practice. And it culminates in a thesis that usually has a real-world application. And so we get very talented people to take a pause out of their busy lives, professional and leadership lives, and really step back and think more critically about it and enhance their skills, and then go back into the fray, so to speak, and make even a greater and more contributions to society and to the profession. And so I'm very proud of this program because of the quality of students we have in it, because of the nature of the training that we provide, but especially because of all the wonderful accomplishments that our students do, both in the program and once they've graduated. So this is a very appropriate venue for us because this program is interdisciplinary, it's problem-focused, and it's around leadership, so I know Dan is a great speaker with those themes in mind. So now I'd like to introduce Deborah Natoli, who has joined us just this past fall as the director of our DPPD program. Deborah is not new to USC. She has actually been an administrator here as the director of faculty development for the USC Marshall School of Business, where she also taught counseling. She taught quantitative methods and other leadership topics in the Marshall School. She's also been an administrator at St. Louis University, so she's had experience at more than one university. And she's advised and mentored several PhD and doctoral students over her career. And she was founder of the Center for Excellence in Teaching at St. Louis University. So we're very pleased to have this creative, intelligent person join our staff, and please welcome Deborah Natoli.
Welcome, welcome everyone. Thank you, Jack. That was a lovely introduction. And I want to welcome all of you here to the School of Policy, Planning and Development. And we're really thrilled that this is going to be a group from across disciplines to join us today. And because we are really celebrating the orientation for our doctoral program, at the same time we want to reach across the campus and introduce people to hear Dan today. I want to thank our dean, Jack Knott, because if it weren't for him, we wouldn't have this today. And I think that Jack has a breath he's a breath of fresh air. I think he's an incredible dean. He has the integrity and wisdom to guide us. And I think what's important to me, what's touched me about knowing him, is that he wants for each person to become the best of who they can be and take that into the world to change the world and to support society in any way they can. So thank you, Jack. I also want to thank Dan, of course, for being here, and for all of you who have come today. Cherry Short, my friend, thank you for being here, and Jan, who's our Director of Communications, who helped put all this together. and for all of you at SBD who have made this possible. So I want to introduce Dan Siegel to you. And Dan, I studied with him for about a year and a half, and Dan is the executive director of the Mindsight Institute. He at the same time is a UCLA professor, and he teaches courses, but he really is the founder of a concept called Mindsight, or interpersonal neurobiology. And I can tell you more about Dan. I can tell you that he spoke and presented to the president of Thailand, and I can tell you all kinds of things like that, but you can find those on his website. And that would just be a surface level of touching who Dan is and how profoundly his work can affect our lives. So instead of just telling you those kinds of things, I want to tell you about a 1-minute story that really exemplifies how Dan has affected my life and the lives of people I work with. And I'm going to go back to St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I'm from. And there is a man named Jeff Smith, who's very much like our DPPD students. He was an adjunct professor of political science at Washington University. He founded a charter school for students who are underprivileged in one of the most profoundly underprivileged neighborhoods in St. Louis. And he was a wonderful and is a wonderful person. And he decided to run for office. And in 2007, he became a Missouri state senator. And he went door to door to get his campaign started, and he went into some of these poor neighborhoods. And what happened is that in 2009, he had to resign his post. And he had to resign his post because he made a decision in a split second that changed his life forever. And he wasn't truthful about his campaign. You see, when he was campaigning for a position, what happened was that he knew about the ad campaign that was going against his component. And basically, when he was asked about this, he, in that split second, made a poor decision. And I interviewed him before he went to prison. And the reason I tell you this story, this uplifting story, is that we talked about that moment in time when leadership happens. And today, he's no longer in prison. He was there for a year and 1 day. But the point that Dan's going to talk about today is something called Mindsight. Abraham Lincoln called it going to and being in that place where we have our higher angels. How do we make decisions as leaders that affect the world from a place where we transcend ego and think about the bigger picture? How do we find that place in ourselves so we can make those decisions? So Dan has brought this to us and is going to talk to us about that state of mind whereby we can activate and engage those leadership qualities. Dan?
Well, thank you, Dean Knott, for the introduction, for having me here, and Deborah Natoli, thank you for bringing me here. I am actually a USC graduate. I went to college here, and this is my first time ever being asked to come back to speak to my alma mater. So this is a pretty big moment for me, and I'm very nervous. What's that? That's leadership, someone said. So it's a pleasure to be back here. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's because I went to UCLA and started earning a living there instead of paying tuition, which I actually didn't do because I was the son of a professor who was here. But I did pay for parking. And as you know, at SC, that's a hunting license. So I was hunting back in those days. So what I'm going to tell you about is this thing called Mindsight, and I'll give you a little background and weave that in with what people interested in public policy can benefit from by really examining some fundamental issues about the mind and about relationships and about the brain. And to give you just the brief background, I'm going to just set an intellectual stage for you so you can understand the framework we're talking about, which in a sense is very startling. And I wake up in the morning and I tell my wife, who's also a USC graduate, or I tell my brother, who's also a USC graduate, or I tell my mom, who's also a USC graduate, these things, because they're kind of really like being in Alice in Wonderland. So I'll just start with a few strange facts. This morning, I talked to a bunch of teachers at a local school, and I asked them, as I have now over 4,000 teachers, what are you trying to teach, K through 12, in your experience of being a teacher? And basically everyone says the same thing. I'm trying to develop the what of my student? The mind. Excellent. That's what they say. They all say that. I said, great. Now you're all in higher degrees of education. Yes, yes, yes. Great. When you went through your training in education, I asked them, how many of you had even like one lecture that told you what the mind is? And this morning I had 60 people in the room at this one little school. How many people do you think raised their hand? One. One person. And I've asked over 4,000 teachers now. It's about 2%. Now I've asked 100,000, no exaggeration, 100,000 mental health professionals from all over this planet, from every kind of field of mental health, psychology, psychiatry, social work, and occupational therapy, educational therapy, you can go on and on. I've asked them the same question, and the number, strangely enough, is the same. 2 to 5% is the range, have ever had even one lecture on what the mind is. Now, how many of you think that's a little odd that a mental health profession never got around to doing the mental of the mental health? You know, my wife is an attorney. Did I mention she's also a graduate of USC? Yes. So when she went to law school, you know, they did all their stuff, and I go out to dinner with her friends sometimes. And if I went to them and said, "Hey, you lawyers, when you went to law school, did you ever have a definition given to you of what law was?" And they said, "No, we never got around to it." You wouldn't feel comfortable going to them. So when I became an educator in the field of mental health years ago, it was really kind of embarrassing to realize that this field that I was devoting my life to basically lost its mind. And what could we do about it? So back in 1991, I was trained through the National Institute of Mental Health to study how relationships shape the mind of the child. Thoughts, feelings, ways of regulating emotion, ways of making decisions when you're in a pinch, just like Deborah was talking about in that story. And that way of being flexible is something you can study. And so I wanted to know, how did relationships affect those things? Because when I was at USC, in addition to being a biochemistry major and studying we were trying to find the enzyme that allowed salmon to go from freshwater to saltwater and not die. That's a big deal, actually, to be a freshwater fish and then become a salt. People are going, what? If you're a fish nut, you know what I'm talking about. You have to live in a certain environment. And when you change environments, if you don't have the right, biochemical stuff going on, you die. Well, at the same time I was doing that during the day in Arnie Dunn's lab, I was actually working at night. I don't know if they still have it here, the suicide prevention hotline. Do we still have it? So I was working at night, and I was trained that what you said in a relationship with someone on the phone could make the difference between that person killing themselves or deciding there was hope. And that really struck me, that a relationship based on communication could make the difference between life or death, just like an enzyme could. So back here at SC, when I was a college student, I was really thinking there must be a way to find the commonality across a relational experience and an enzymatic one. That there had to be some kind of, I'm a biologist, some kind of biological mechanism that they shared. So I thought the best place to explore that would be medical school, which any of you who've gone to medical school know that's actually not the best place to study that, or to study anything about subjective experience or empathy or anything like that. So, but I didn't know that. I was very naive. I was a very young college student, and I went off to school. And when I went to medical school, I was amazed to find that the professors, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, treated people like they were walking bags of chemicals. Now, I was trained here as a biochemist. I worked in biochemistry labs. I gave lectures as a young student on the discoveries we found, because we actually found the enzyme. And there I was with a bunch of biochemistry-oriented physicians who were treating human beings like they had no subjective core of who they were. Now, why is that a problem? After all, aren't we just bags of chemicals that you can use a scalpel with or a medicine with to just change? What's the big deal, right? So this was what really bothered me in those first years of school. And ultimately, when I saw that they were treating patients like that, they would go in and say to someone, you have cancer, you're going to probably die in 2 weeks, I'm sorry, goodbye. Like that. And the professors would leave, bless you, and I'd be sitting there going, that's not right. There's something wrong about that. I mean, not to be judgmental, because you're supposed to be mindful, but mindfulness is not the same as accepting everything as it is. It's just being aware of what is and not having preconceived judgments that you grasp onto. But there's something that felt really wrong in a discerning kind of way. So after dropping out of medical school, I decided I would become a salmon fisherman and journeyed to actually the Pacific Northwest, came back, and ultimately decided to go back and do the studies that I ended up doing in pediatrics and psychiatry and research psychiatry and then educational stuff. So what I'm going to share with you are a couple of amazing realities that I think have incredible relevance for public policy and that definitely have relevance for how we function as human beings. And after all, most of what you do in public policy has something to do with human beings, wouldn't you say? So you can certainly take the attitude of learning a science and just think about large-scale systems issues and what you have to do with a system that's functioning in this organization and this thing. But it all comes down to people. And even if you study works on what makes an organization great, you probably know this. What is it that makes an organization great? The people and the relationships among them, right? So what is a relationship? And let's say you're interested in a little more in science. When you study the science, let's say, of health, medical health, that is not getting a disease, and a corollary, you live longer, longevity, or the wacky thing called happiness. Happiness, longevity, health, and even wisdom. What is the commonality of those four domains of study? It's actually relationships. Relationships let you live longer, relationships let you be healthier, relationships allow you to be happier, and relationships, when you ask anybody about wise people, have to do with people who respect the deep integrity of another person. It's incredible. So what is a relationship? And does it have anything to do with public policy? Let's start with the latter one. Does what you do have anything to do with people's relationships with each other? Yes? No? Yes? 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 Okay, good. I just want to make this relevant for you. Otherwise, you can say, well, let's go out to the beach. Well, you can't go to the beach so easily from here. But you can go out somewhere. Okay, so relationships are important. What is a relationship? It's an interaction, exactly. And what's interacting? Like now between in the relationship I'm setting up with you, what's actually happening in this interaction between me sitting up in this body and you sitting in that body? Communication, exactly. And what is communication comprised of? Information exchange. And how do we exchange information with each other? We have a common language. Excellent. We have a common language, and how do we transmit that language from one person to another? Like if I'm on the phone on the Suicide Prevention Service up in, what's that building called over there? The Student Center? I don't know if that's where it's still, it was always secret where it was. We were up there. How am I actually getting that language across on the phone? Verbally, and what am I doing through those phone lines? I'm transmitting what? Information through energy. Actually, all information is transmitted through energy. Now, this is something that is not commonly accepted in psychology. I was recently teaching with some professors in Holland who are from the States, some of them, and I was saying something about energy, and they really got upset. They said, that's not what we do in psychology. We don't talk about energy. I said, why? They said, it's unscientific. So I said, well, I think E equals mc squared is a scientific equation. And they just gave me the little disrespectful wave of the hand. So energy is how we transmit information, absolutely. It's totally true. Energy, whether it's in the form of air molecules moving for sound or photons for what we see, everything you do in a relationship is transmitted by energy. So you can actually literally be scientific about it if you go into an organization, or you look at a system, or you look at, let's say, a city, or you look at a society. You can actually study the way energy is transmitted and how certain patterns of energy have information to them. So what's the difference between just energy and information? Like if I say to you, do any of you speak Greek? No. Okay. So if I say to you, glikanera. Glikanera. Now what'd that do for you? Nothing. Because you don't speak, it's just Greek to you. Literally, it's a Greek term. But if I say Golden Gate Bridge, okay, did any of you just have an experience? So someone share what happened when you heard Golden Gate Bridge. You got an image? What did it experience? What was it like in your subjective experience? You felt your stomach lift?
Yeah, I had a good experience there a year ago.
So you had the emotional good experience. Great. It looks very good based on what your face is doing. Would you like to share with us a little bit more? No, that's enough in this public setting. Okay. So, right. So you have all these things associated with it because Golden Gate Bridge has information to it. Now, just in that exchange right there, you can see that Glikanara also starts with a G. It's just sound waves. But Golden Gate Bridge, also sound waves, got an impact, and I wish you could see her face. You said a very nice impact, about the information contained in it. So what's the difference between just energy, like Glikanara for you, and information? It's the value placed on that energy flow, exactly. And value in this case means it's something that symbolizes something other than itself. So in other words, Golden Gate Bridge is just a bunch of air molecules moving, just like Glikanara, just air molecules moving. But Golden Gate Bridge has an energy pattern that you match with prior experience. So it has symbolic value. It means something. It has a value to it. And this is really important because when you're setting up an organization, the information in the organization has everything to do with shared meaning, like values, like goals, like a direction that people take. And if you have people in an organization, you're setting up a policy where people can't share information, they're going to have a very different experience, let's say, of being isolated, of not caring, of not being passionate about what they do. And as you know from all sorts of studies of organizational functioning, when the relationships are like that, without shared systems of information exchange, then what happens is people in the range of what someone can do in an organization, if here's where you need to be not to get fired, and here's where you're expected to be, but here's where you could be if you're really devoted, they all hang out at the lower range, just barely doing what they need to do so they don't get fired. And that organization just putters along. And the policies that are established around that make a very inefficient, unfun place to work. But if you get people impassioned, right, about what they're doing, and they share information like values and goals, how do they work? They put in the extra because it's not really putting in the extra because they love what they're doing. These are human beings. Work is not just work. It's a place to experience the love of your life. And that's just a whole different attitude. And when you have organizational leaders who realize that an organization is really about relationships, and they do that by seeing the mind of the person we'll talk about in just a moment, everything is different. And so when you have public policies that are cold, like when I went to school, I was on the curriculum committee as a young student, medical school, and I would say things like, we have no time to get to know each other. I don't know the professors, I don't know my classmates, we're working 6 days a week. And the professor said, well, what do you want to change? I said, well, how about if we have time to meet each other? How about 5 days a week? And they said, well, how do we know you're not going to be going to a park or going to a museum on Saturday? I said, did you really say that? Yes. How would we be sure you'd be in the library studying? I said, well, I probably wouldn't be. That's the whole point, So it never happened. But after I came back, actually, this is at Harvard, they actually did listen to what we said. And they transformed the whole school. And the place totally changed. They got millions and millions of dollars, much like what happened here at SC very recently. And it was all for undergraduate education. And they built this huge building so that they could have FaceTime, literally, so that people could get to know the professors. They'd go out to the professors' houses for dinner. Everything was different. It was in small groups. And they did listen to us, even though there was a lot of complaints in the beginning. So you can make an institution like a school be a relational institution. Now, the reason we start with relationships is because a lot of people are very interested in the brain, and they focus on the brain a lot, which we're going to do right now. But I just want to start with relationships because I want to tell you that our mental lives are not just the activity of the brain. And so I know you have a very, very strong neuroscience department here at USC now. And I'm going to tell you, if we had some of your faculty here, they would absolutely disagree with what I'm about to say to you, because they have. And I'll just warn you that you can't go to a cocktail party tonight and just go quoting me and expect to make friends with the big fancy people you have in neuroscience. So just be careful that you're mindful, you're aware, you're awake to realize that what I'm about to tell you is not commonly viewed from the fields of neuroscience or psychology. Okay? But it comes straight out of research that I and other people have done in the field of relational science. I'm an attachment researcher. I study the way relationships between parents and children shape the mind and brain of the child. And I'm a psychotherapist, so I'm doing this all the time. And in the MindSight Institute, we have an extensive bunch of training programs where we hear people literally all over the world, in Thailand, and we have people in Iran, we have people in Africa, and people in Asia, all over the place are joining together in a common discussion about these issues. And so what I'm going to say to you is this, is that when I finished my training in 1991, it was the beginning of the decade of the brain. And I assembled 40 scientists who I had studied with as a National Institute of Mental Health fellow. And I brought them together and I said, let's ask one question, this group. Let's ask the question, what is the connection between the mind and the brain? That was it. 40 scientists from over a dozen different disciplines of science. And we began with the easier one, which is actually the brain. What's the brain? It's an organ, and where is it located? It's in your skull. It's actually connected to the entire body. So you could never really talk about the brain separate from the body. So I often say the embodied brain, just to remind you of that. But my daughter, who's a teenager, says that that's redundant, and she rolls her eyes. You know, and so and if you have a teenage kid at home, you know that's not good to get there saying you're redundant. So I still put in parentheses when I say it. So every time I say embodied brain, you know I'm saying with parentheses so she doesn't get mad at me. And here's the issue of the embodied brain. Yes, it's in the skull, the thing we usually call brain, but it's extensively connected to the whole body in hormonal ways, in immune function, in the cardiovascular function, every kind of way. It's a part of the body, but we'll call it the brain because people feel comfortable with that. Now, how many neurons are in the skull part of the brain? It's 100 billion. And Deborah is giving me a little more time. We're going to review each one of them right now. 100 billion neurons. And how does this brain develop over time? Two ways. Genes, the information in genes determine connections among neurons in all sorts of fascinating ways. And experience. Experience shapes the connections among neurons, which are called what? Synapses. Excellent. Synapses, the joining place. And basically what the nervous system is all about, including the brain, is the passage of ions in and out of a membrane called an action potential. It's kind of like an electrical flow, but not really. It's a charge differential. Don't worry about that. But it's like, think of it like an electrical flow, the action potential. So it's energy flow, basically, of electrons, charged particles. And when it gets to the end of the synapse, what happens to that very end? What's released? A chemical, a neurotransmitter, exactly. And it floats across that synaptic space from the presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic one. What's going to happen at the receiving end? Like a football player. What's going to happen now? It's going to catch the chemical almost like a lock receiving a key, and then that chemical transmission of energy will literally make chemical transitions, so the receptor will change the porous nature of the membrane, and you'll have an action potential or not going down. That's basically what neural firing means. The reason in public policy we care about synaptic connections is because synaptic connections shape the architecture of the brain that in part gives rise to your mental experience, like are you happy or not? Or are you going to work that extra oomph in a job? Or are you going to care about what's happening in your community? Those are all synaptically related functions. So you can understand the synapses are really, really important. Okay, so experience shapes them, genes shape them. What's one way that genes shape our synaptic architecture? Something called temperament. We're all different. We have temperament. You can have different kinds of issues in your life that you struggle with, seizure disorders, or there are psychiatric conditions people can talk about. There are ways of being in a world that are different. And you can have all sorts of things happen based on your synapses. So understanding that is really important. So then we got to the question of, okay, we've defined the brain in this group. Then the question was, what's the mind? And there was nothing that any one of the 40 people could say that would get them to agree with each other. A neuroscientist would say it's just brain activity. That's it. Hardware, software, something like that. And an anthropologist sitting in the room, she would say, that's ridiculous. The mind is how people relate to each other. in a community that's passed across generations. I don't give a hoot about the brain, she'd say. And then another person would say, well, you know, I study psychology and I'm studying the way feelings and thoughts influence things. And everyone had a different view. So the group was going to dissolve. And back in 1992, the beginning of the decade of the brain, I offered them a definition that I'm going to give to you right now, which amazingly, if you're in academics, you know why this is amazing, there was 100% agreement among 40 academics that this definition met their perspective of what the mind, in their view, could be considered as. And since that time, almost 20 years ago now, I've been using this definition in trying to really push a change in the fields of education and mental health. And I think public policy can use it too. So here's the definition. The mind can be considered, of course, just to make sure we're all on the same page, a process that has consciousness. And we have no idea what consciousness is. We know some of the neural correlates about it, but we don't know what it is. We know there's a feeling of the known and the knowing. But other than that, we actually don't know much about it from a scientific point of view. That's one thing, consciousness. The mind also is a word we refer to talk about subjective experience. So when you study physicians, for example, who have a person with a common cold, and you train those physicians to tune into the subjective experience of a person with a cold, you know what happens? That person gets over the cold a day sooner and their immune function increases. So unlike my professors in medical school who didn't respect the subjective experience of their patients or their students, we now have hard evidence that a clinical encounter that lacks that kind of empathy, which is the tuning into the subjective experience of another person, that's what empathy is, actually is counterproductive. So in medical school, it's an opportunity to actually tell young students to hold on to the empathy that all studies show they lose when they go through the socialization process of medical school, even to this day. Repeated studies in the last 30 years have shown you get a very empathic young pre-medical student, you get a very horribly empathy deficient graduate of medical school. And if you've ever been through that experience, you know why. You're just basically treated as if the subjective inner world of other people doesn't matter, and you're given no tools to strengthen your own subjective experience. So all you can do is go into hiding. It's so sad and so unnecessary, because we actually have the tools to strengthen people's ability to stay present with subjective experience. So okay, so it's consciousness and subjective experience, fine. But here's a definition I offered to them. Those are just descriptions. Here's a definition. One aspect of the mind is this. It's an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. An embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Now, what does that mean from a scientific point of view? Then we'll talk about its implications. From a scientific point of view, when you have a system that's open, so it receives stuff from outside of itself, like a person, or like a cloud, let's say, and it's capable of chaotic behavior, we call it a what? We call it a complex system. A complex system. And what the science of complexity tells you is that complex systems have the following features to them. Number one, they're nonlinear. That means small inputs lead to large and unpredictable outputs. So let's say you're an organizational leader and you're dealing with some kind of community issue or some kind of policy that the government's going to set up or organizational functioning. You need to know that in these complex systems, things happen. People leave your lecture because they're bored out of their minds. And all of your issues about being rejected in elementary school need to be dealt with. So you need to be open to what's happening. That's the nonlinearity of it. The second thing is that there are the constraints that influence this thing that are both internal to the system and external to the system. And the third thing, the biggest thing, is something that is a really important word for you in public policy, which is self-organization. From the mathematics of complex systems says that what's going to emerge out of a system is something called self-organization. And what self-organization means is that it will regulate the changes of this system over time. And that's straight out of mathematics. I'm not making that up. That's just pure science. So here's the proposal. The mind is a self-organizing, emergent process that arises as energy and information is shared among people and also, that's the relational part, and also passes through the various aspects of the nervous system we're just going to call the brain. But it's through the whole body. And once you say that, everything changes. Why? Because you now know where the mind is. It's in two places. It's in relationships, which is why public policy issues are so important. Organizational leadership is so important, because they're all about relationships. But it's also in the body that we're just call brain. Now, what does it also tell you? If it's regulating, here's what you can do. And this you can do. You know, Google, for some reason, has me keep on going up there to give lectures, and you can watch these lectures on Google University. So I said to them, why are you having me come? They said, well, we want you to teach the Googlers how to strengthen their minds, you know? So I said, all right, let's go, let's do it. And you'll see these 2-hour-long talks at Google University, which were, you know, projected out to the whole Google universe. And you can see them because what I said to them is basically what I'm saying to you right this moment. I said, if you say it's a regulatory self-organizing process, what does it take to regulate? How many of you drive a car? Well, SC, don't you have to drive? Isn't that like a requirement to be here? You drive a car. Okay, now how do you drive your car? What do you do? Anybody? Yeah.
I turn it on and I tell it where to go through manipulating and control.
Great. So you have to manipulate the direction and the speed and whether it's going or not going. Excellent. Okay? And one part of regulation is modulating something or modifying it. In this case, we're talking about energy and information flow. And what if we put you in the car and blindfolded you? That wouldn't end well. That's right. We'd all get off the road. So you have to be able to see as well as shape. You have to be able to monitor as well as modify. Now, if we have our wonderful cameraman here, and he didn't have a tripod, and he was doing his whole video of this presentation like this, right? Because it wasn't stabilized, his lens of seeing what was going on in this room. Now, you'd be okay, but he's doing that stuff. And then we plugged it into a monitor and we watched it. What would it look like if the monitoring was unstable? It would be unstable, and what would it actually look like when we put it on the screen? It would be a blur, exactly. So how much detail would you see if the stuff was blurry going in? Very little. Now, when you can't see much of the detail, how can you modify it? It'd be hard, if not impossible. There'd be no details to grab onto to shift and change. So the first thing about this definition of mind is you can teach people to monitor energy and information flow patterns with more stability. And it changes everything. I'll give you an example. We're not going to do it here, but I invite you. If you go to my website, there's a monitoring skill building practice called the Wheel of Awareness practice. And I've been now giving this to thousands of people, and we get hundreds of emails back. And it's actually, I don't want to be too exuberant, but I'll curb my enthusiasm, but it's really very rewarding to hear people's response. Now, why do they have these hugely positive responses to the Wheel of Awareness practice? In this practice, what you do is you train the focus of your attention to stabilize the mind-sight lens. Mind-sight is a word that I made up in medical school when I went back after salmon fishing. I went back and I said, there are some professors who don't see the mind and they're mind-sightless and do not use them as role models. In fact, use them as anti-role models. And there are going to be some that see the mind, that have mind sight, and those are the ones you should be hanging out with. And I would have this discerning thing. And then I found out as a psychiatry trainee that concept was actually quite useful in teaching mind sight to other people. Now, what is mind sight? Mind sight is the ability to see energy and information flow patterns. Where? Where would you see them? Through your actions in interaction with people, your relationships, and where else is the mind? It's mind sight, you're seeing the mind. So one is relationships. Where else are you going to look? In your body. It's embodied and it's relational. This is why this is so simple. I mean, there's actually not much to remember. It's the good news. It's just enacting it. So, for example, in the story that Deborah told, if that person had been trained with mind sight skills, like I'm going to teach you about now in general terms, in the moment he was asked a certain question, he'd be able to stay present in his body. He'd be able to monitor energy and information flow. He'd feel his muscles tensing. He'd be able to feel the impulse to lie. and he would put a space between impulse and action called response flexibility, and I'll talk to you about what areas of the brain do that. Because these mind-sight areas of the brain, when you develop them, they change the way a person exists on the planet. So he could have those tense muscles, he could feel it, he could even image in his mind's eye that he's about to lie, and then he'd have a whole set of other options, and then he'd be able to review them. And so instead of lying, he could say, you know something, of course a part of me wants to say this, but I'm not going to. Maybe I'll tell the truth, because as Mark Twain said, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything, right? You don't have to keep track of all the lies you made. It's actually a pretty good way to live, you know? It really is. It makes a life of well-being and ease, you know? It doesn't mean you say everything on your mind, but it means you know what the truth is, and you're true to that. So if he had these skills, he could monitor everything going on in the body and in relationships. This is the neat thing about the definition, is that you know where to look, and you know what you're looking for. And you can teach students from kindergarten onward into graduate school these mind-sight skills. I wish I had been taught them instead of having all the troubles that I've written about of, you know, when I don't need to go into it, but, you know, when I came back, when Harvard asked me to go back to give a lecture to them in a room about this size, I had written a book on the developing mind. I wrote Parenting from the Inside Out, and I wrote a book called The Mindful Brain. And they wanted me to speak about the importance of mindfulness in medical education. So I came there to give the talk with Ellen Langer, who was a professor there, and some other people. And I was up first, right? And I was going to tell them all about my book, and the book had just come out, and I was great. And I looked, and in the back row were all the deans now retired when I had been in school. Dean Tosteson, Dean Fetterman. And I looked at them, and I had been on the curriculum committee with them back in the day, you know. So, and I realized they came back to hear me talk. And one of my friends was actually sitting next to him, a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who's big in the mindfulness world. And I looked over to John, I didn't know what to do, and I looked at the deans and I said, okay, I was going to give you a talk about the mindful brain, and I'm ready to show you all the slides and all that stuff, but you know something, I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to tell you why I dropped out of school, because I've never told anyone that. And then I spent my 20 minutes that they gave me telling them about how painful it was to be trained as a clinician and be given no tools whatsoever to be understanding my own mind and the importance of the mind of my patients. And John tells me, who was in the back row, I couldn't see, that they were crying. They were all in tears. And it just made me realize that, these things we talk about are real. They meant well, but we just didn't know that you could actually teach these things. That you could actually teach people to define the mind. And you could say to a young clinician, I'm going to train your mind to be strong so you keep track of the mind of your patients. And you decrease your burnout. And you stay wide awake. And in fact, you improve your well-being. And a study just showed you increase your enzyme called telomerase. You guys know about telomeres? Telomeres are the ends of chromosomes that allow your cell to keep on living. And when you cut them down, like with stress and things like that, when they're whittled down enough, the cell dies. Focusing on the mind in a mindful way has been now shown to increase the enzyme that keeps your cells alive. So I'm not just talking about, this is going to feel good, in California we have to be very careful of that. He's a touchy-feely good guy. No, we're talking about increasing telomerase, and one of the co-authors of that study won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomerase. She was on that study. This is the level we're talking about when you learn to focus your attention. Now, how are you focusing your attention? You're focusing it so you stabilize this mind-sight lens with openness to what is. So I may not want a patient to be dying, but I realize I have to be open to the fact she's dying. So I stay present with that. I realize I have a wish she wouldn't die, but she is. Objectivity. I'm feeling really agitated that as a young student, I wish I could help her, but I can't. I'm feeling helpless. I'm feeling hopeless. I feel frustrated. I didn't go to medical school to be hopeless and helpless, but that's the feeling I'm having. It's just a feeling. It'll come and go, right? And I have observation. These are the three legs of the tripod: openness, objectivity, and observation. I observe myself. Here's this young medical student feeling so frustrated, he just wants to change the subject and act like this person has no internal source of desperate fear that she's just been given a diagnosis that she's going to die. So when you have a tripod of openness, objectivity, and observation, literally you take that camera there and you stabilize it So I sit present, and I'm a human being, so of course I feel terrible that we just got this diagnosis. Of course I feel horrible myself. I didn't go to be a helpless person. I went to help people. But you can't always help people. So it allows you to be fully present with what is, right? And then what you do is you modify it. So in the Wheel of Awareness practice, which I invite you all to come to the website, drdansiegel.com, drdansiegel.com. It used to be called the Mindsight Institute. But my wife and other people who work at the Institute said, you have to change it to your name. I said, that's sick. I don't want it to be, it's not about me. It's about the Mindsight Institute. Mindsight, they said, yeah, but people have a relationship with you, and you have to be a human being. You can't just be an institute. You have to have a face. So reluctantly, we changed it. So anyway, that's the website name. And so you go there, and you get this free download of the Wheel of Awareness practice. And you'll see that it teaches you to be open, to be objective, and to have observation. Those are the things that stabilize the lens. And then it does the next thing, which I'm going to talk about right now, which if you took this on as a policy for, well, the public, for organizations, for communities, for schools, I want to get feedback from you when we do the question and answer pretty soon, period, what you think about this. But we've been applying it in therapy. We've been applying it now in schools. There's a book called Whole Brain Child, which applies it for parenting. And it goes like this. Fine, you say. Dan has offered a definition of the mind that, doesn't exist in psychology, doesn't exist in psychiatry. Cognitive neuroscience doesn't have a definition of mind. Even, believe it or not, the philosophy of mind does not have a definition of mind. Some people just wrote a book called Mind, Brain, and Education Sciences. Beautiful book about education and the mind and the brain. And they have a great glossary at the end. And you know what they had in the entry for brain, discussion of the brain, education, discussion of the brain, mind, you know what they put there? They forgot to put it in. They forgot to put it in. Can you imagine that? And then when I combed through the text, you know what they said the definition of mind was? The first statement was it's a self-concept. I have no idea what that is. What's a self-concept? What does that mean? I don't know. But then it goes on, it goes, the mind is just the activity of the brain. Right. Now here's the problem. If you think the mind is just the activity of the brain, then you're a slave to the brain. But we know now the mind can change the function and structure of the brain. You know that. You can use the focus of your attention to change the activity of the brain and then do something we call SNAG, stimulate neuronal activation and growth. The way you get a brain to change its structure is by stimulating its activation. You turn on genes and you create new synaptic connections. So we had people with attention deficit problems in our Mindful Awareness Research Center. We took them an open study. We have to get funding to do the closed study, but of course, given what I'm about to tell you, you can realize we're not going to get any funding from anyone, pharmaceutical at least. We were able to show that if you teach people to do these kinds of tripods training exercises, in this case they were mindfulness-based exercises like they did with the telomerase study, we got more improvements on executive function like controlling attention, regulating emotion, things like that, than you get with medications. And when we showed it to our colleagues in the pharmaceutical world, they said, what's the dose? That's incredible. We've never seen results like that. And we said, take away the C and put a T. And they said, what? We said, we did meditation, not medication. And I have no problem with medications whatsoever, but if you have the opportunity, in addition to medications, and sometimes instead of medications, to offer someone a way to focus their attention in a new way and change the structure of their brain, why not offer it to them? I mean, why not? It may not cost anything. It may not make any companies any money, but it helps people. So this is kind of the movement we're talking about, is realizing that the mind is not just the activity of the brain. The mind uses the brain and relationships to actually create itself. Now, how is it trying to create itself? Here's what I'm going to tell you about. This is a long story that I'm going to condense into like a 2-minute little take-home message. And if I didn't have the experience I had last summer where I had 15 interns come and study with me, and I wrote a book called The Developing Mind out in '99. It couldn't be used in colleges anymore. It's a textbook. It couldn't be used because it was over 10 years old. There's a policy. So they said, you have to revise it. So I said, okay. So I got these 15 interns, or they got me, or whatever. We had each other. And I said to them, you're going to take this book, which proposes interpersonal neurobiology as a consilient field that combines all sciences into one view. And I said, I want you to prove that this book is wrong. that everything or anything in this book is wrong. And they were put into teams so they could work collaboratively together, and they went after it to try to destroy it, which was great. And then I took the book, I projected it in its Word document up on the wall, and we went over every sentence. And we combed through over 2,000 new scientific studies to look at the statements and the hypotheses that that book made. And I'm happy to report that basically everything held up. And not only did everything hold up, but the proposals were confirmed by new technologies that were established in the last 10 years that didn't exist earlier. So what I'm going to say to you comes from the hypotheses from the developing mind, but the second edition has all of the science that now affirms what I'm about to tell you. So even though what I'm going to say to you seems too simple to be true, and I wake myself up in the middle of the night, sometimes pinching myself, and when my wife gets up, I said, this can't be this simple. She says, well, it's not that it's simple, it's just that it's easy to remember. So here's how it goes. Whether you're looking at a body or you're looking at a relationship, when a mind is able to take different elements of a system and honor and cultivate the differences, and then promote linkages, you get something called what? What's the linkage of differentiated parts called? Integration, exactly. Integration. And when you make the proposal that integration is the basis of health, you can go into the body and demonstrate that that's true. You can go into a one-on-one relationship and demonstrate that when two people are in a relationship and they honor each other's differences and promote compassionate communication, that relationship thrives. Like in a marriage or a friendship or a student-teacher relationship or whatever, patient-therapist relationship. If you study a family, like I do, an attachment, basically what I just summarized is the entire field of attachment research. When parents honor the differences among their children and promote compassionate communication, those are called secure attachments. When you look at organizational functioning, like in a school, let's start with a classroom or the larger school at large. If you look at the work of Michael Rudder, integrative practices where the principal honors the opinions of the teacher and honors their differences, but then promotes their communicating together. If you know the 10,000 hour study of Sir Michael Rudder, you know that study, when those are the public policies brought on by the leader in this case, an organization like a school, that school thrives. They had a principal switch over. You know this study? It's amazing. They were studying the 10,000 hours that kids put in. One school, low morale. People were absolutely miserable. They had terrible scores. Same socioeconomic status as a nearby school, which was just the opposite. High morale. People were happy to be there. They did great in tests. And in the middle of this long-term study, all those values switched. And they said, oh my God, what happened? Is there something in the water? Is there something in the food? What is it? One thing switched. The principles were switched. And then they studied what was the difference. And the administrator who said, this is my opinion, I don't really care about your opinion, this is the way we're going to do it, those schools did terribly. But when there was a head of the school who could really say, your opinion is important, tell me about it. Your opinion is important too, tell me about it. Let's talk to each other about how we want to make our school work. The kids could feel that. And then kids were empowered too, the students. So that's an example of integration at an organizational level. There's all sorts of ways you can look at this in terms of the narratives we have and all sorts of things. The bottom line is, integration is something you can train your mind to detect when it's present or when it's absent. When it's present or when it's absent. The manifestations of integration when it's present is very much the feeling. Have you ever, well, let me see, do any of you sing in a choir? 2 people, we don't have enough. If you can imagine, I'm trying to think if I did this at Google. I don't know if it's up on any of those videos, but imagine a choir coming up here, just to give you a feeling. The choir comes up here, let's say we have 8 people, all right? And then I say to them, all right, sing a song, however you want to sing a song. For whatever reason, 70% of the time I do this, they sing Amazing Grace. I don't know why. But then I read a book by Daniel Levitin which said Amazing Grace in the Western canon is the most harmonic song that exists. And the feeling of harmony is integration, right? It's when you see people joining together about the song, linking their voices, but harmonizing in intervals that are unique. So there's differences, they're differentiated voices, and they're linked. Now, if we then take the choir and we say, hey, close your ears so tightly you don't hear each other at all and belt out a song. Okay, you can imagine that? What would it sound like? It would be cacophony. It would be chaos. Would there be differentiation? Think about it. Would they be differentiating what they're doing? Yeah, they're closing their ears, they're doing whatever they want. Is there linkage? No. So if you have differentiation, no linkage, what's impaired? Integration. Integration is impaired, and then in this case you get chaos. Imagine if we made people sing exactly the note the same exact way for like half an hour. Oh, what would that be? It would be monotony. It could be a chant but you get overtones with a chant. But you get monotony, you'd get rigidity, you get unchangingness. There'd be differentiation? No. There'd be linkage? Yes. Impaired integration. So here's the deal. Impaired integration takes two forms: chaos or rigidity. And when you go into an organization and you see that an organization isn't functioning well, if you think about it, whether the organization is a school or a large community, or just talk about our society, when it's not functioning well, often there is chaos or rigidity. Those are signs of dysfunction. If you take, in my field, in mental health, if you go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, it's our Bible. And I did this back in 1995 or whenever I did it, and I did it now with the interns last summer. If you take that Bible and you open that book up to any syndrome of any symptom of any syndrome, you will find it's an example of chaos, rigidity, or both. And then what we did was we looked for any evidence that the psychiatric disorders that are studied from the DSM have neurological impairments to integration. And now the technology is advanced enough with diffusion tensor imaging, the default mode studies, other forms of MRI studies, where you can show that whether it's a genetically induced issue like bipolar disorder, or we don't know what's causing autism, but in autism, or in post-traumatic stress, what you find is impairments to neural integration. So those are all examples where we get chaos and rigidity. So what do you do as a public policy person? Here's what I want to invite you to do, and then you tell me, as you go forward in your careers, how this works. You now know a definition of the mind. You know the mind is based in relationships and the brain. You can look at areas of the brain that I'm talking to you about right now, because we're going till 4:30, right? Good. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about brain anatomy to know what integration of the brain is like. And then you can see, is the system I'm working with in harmony, or is it in chaos or rigidity? That's the whole frame. You see how simple it is? That's what you do. When you find it's in chaos or rigidity, your task as a leader is to seek out the domain of this system you're working with. So in my case, if I'm a therapist working with a family, I want to see where differentiation is not being honored and where linkage is not happening in a family. If I'm working with an individual, there's all these domains of integration. In this book, Mindsight, I look for this. You know, I show you how you can do this. By looking for this, you can actually, like a laser beam, say, here's where there's chaos, here's where there's rigidity, this is the domain that needs help, and focus attention there to promote change. So I had a patient who I talk about there named Stuart, who's 92. 92. First time ever coming for therapy. He had a huge amount of rigidity in his life. And what we did was we did this very focused work to change his life, because the brain is constantly changing in response to experience throughout the lifespan. So that when he was done with therapy, his wife called me up of 60 years, and she asked me, did you give my husband a brain transplant? Because he had changed so much. So let me go through with you a quick review, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, you ready? So Deborah and Dean Knott have provided a model of the brain for you. It's very nice of them. So if you reach under your chair, taped under the chair, put your hand on the chair and lift it up, you'll find your hand. And if you put your thumb in the middle, that's a joke. If you put your, this is why my daughter says, don't try to make jokes. They never work. So she's right. Okay, so if you take your thumb and put your thumb in the middle of your palm, and then put your fingers over the top like that. This will be oriented in your skull like this. This is a pretty handy model of the brain, useful model of the brain. And I'm going to give you a quick anatomy lesson that's going to be like a 5-minute overview of brain development brain structure, and the way attention can be used with knowledge of the brain to transform the integration of the brain part of the mind-brain relationship triangle. You ready? Here's how it goes. Lift up your fingers, lift up your thumb, and let's just get oriented. The wrist represents your spinal cord in your back. That's coming up to the first part of 3 parts of the brain we're going to talk about. This deepest, oldest part of the brain, 300 million years old at least. It's called the reptilian brain. Formal name is brain stem. So the brain stem has a fight, flight, freeze reaction. Okay? Fight, flight, freeze reaction that's helped us survive for 300 million years. So it's serious business. If your ancestors didn't have it, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair. Okay? Really, really important. Part of what happens when someone does an automatic thing to protect themselves is they can activate these brainstem mechanisms that take over our behavior, so we're acting on automatic pilot. And so when a person can't stay present with their own impulses, they can make decisions that end up putting them in jail. Doesn't mean they're bad people, but it means they got taken over by lower structures like the brainstem. You act like a reptile, basically. Okay, so fight, flight, freeze response, also arousal levels. You know, I could give you all the names of the Greek names of the structures and stuff. I won't do that. But basically, the state of arousal of the body, like your heart and lungs and stuff, as well as arousal of the brain in the skull itself, if you're awake or asleep, brainstem mediated. Okay. 200 million years ago, we evolved into mammals. Put your thumb over, and this is the old mammalian part of the brain. What's this called? The limbic area. The limbic area. So L-I-M-B-I-C. The limbic area would have 2 sides to be a perfect model, but most people have only 1 thumb. And I say that, no really, I say that because I said, you know, we all have 1 thumb, and then someone went to a gas station, a guy had 2 thumbs. And she wrote me an email, she said, some people have 2 thumbs. So I always say most of us have 1 thumb. It's true. Okay, so the limbic area has 5 functions that it performs. One is it works very closely with the brainstem to motivate behavior. To motivate behavior. Now these are below the cortex, so this isn't like a flexible form of behavior. So when someone's in a pinch being interviewed and makes a decision to lie, you got to wonder about this limbic brainstem conglomeration that went beyond choice. It was automatic. Okay? Number 1, motivating behavior. Number 2, emotions. Emotions, we believe, are generated by the input of the body to the brainstem and the limbic area, and those 3 are below the cortex, so we call that the subcortical origins of emotion. And emotion is a fascinating topic, we won't get into it now, but emotion too. So motivation, emotion. The 3rd main limbic function is called evaluation or appraisal. What is appraisal? Appraisal basically, at a very minimum, is your brain in this area, the limbic area, says, this thing that's happening is important, I think I'll pay attention. So as a teacher, of course, what you want to do is activate this limbic area to get your students to at least appraise that what you're saying is meaningful. And if you don't do that, they're going to be twittering and all the other things they do. So you have to capture their imagination. So that's the appraisal of orients attention. Does all sorts of other things, but we'll leave it at that, appraisal. The 4th thing that the limbic area does is it distinguishes different kinds of memory. In particular, it has these implicit forms of memory that are the baseline kind of feelings and images you get. And then 2 other kinds of memory are formed by an area called the hippocampus, called factual memory and autobiographical memory. Really, really important. And then the final thing, the 5th limbic function we're going to talk about, is attachment relationships. So I raise frogs at home, we have snakes at home. They don't have attachment. I mean, they can learn. They're not dumb or anything, they can learn. They know when I come to feed them, but they're not attached to me or their babies or anything. Right? Neither are the fish that we have. They don't have a limbic area. But your dog is attached to you because he's a mammal or she's a mammal. So attachment. Attachment is the need young members of our species have to rely on the adult, older, wiser individuals to care for them, to protect them, to take care of them. And then it's what we can give back as attachment figures. That's a limbic orientation. Okay, and now if you swing your fingers over the top, this would be the outer layer of the brain. Does anyone know the name of it? The cortex, absolutely. The outer bark of the brain, the cortex. And this is called the new mammalian brain, so sometimes people call it the neocortex. These are synonyms: cortex, neocortex, cerebral cortex, new mammalian brain. Those are all the same. Cortex, the outer bark of the brain. The best way to remember it is from your second to last knuckles backwards are the back of the brain, and this is where you basically make maps of the external world. It's oversimplified, but it's a good just getting oriented. The back of the brain is for making maps of the world, like what you see, what you hear, stuff like that, what your body touches. From the second to knuckles forward is the front of the brain, which developed in our primate evolution, right? So millions of years ago, we developed this part of the brain, and the frontal lobe allows you to think. And the very frontmost part of the frontal lobe is called the what? So you have the frontal lobe, and the front is called the prefrontal. It's the prefrontal cortex, so it's behind your forehead, okay? And there's lots of areas of that, but the side is for focusing attention. This is the dorsolateral area. And then there's a middle zone we're going to talk about right now because it has everything to do with public policy, believe it or not. These middle areas have a very important function. And I think the best way to tell you about it is to tell you a very, very quick story. I took care of a patient where she stopped talking, 7 years old. Brought her in. She one day saw a video thing I had, and she brought in a VHS. I don't know if you remember what those are, but that's the videotape. And she put it in, and we saw this beautiful picture of her interacting with her mother in the most beautiful way you can imagine. And she says to me, for the first time talking in months and months and months, she says, "That's what my mom used to be like before her car accident." And out in the waiting room was a woman nothing like the woman on the screen. The woman in the waiting room was impulsive, seemed to be apathetic, and she was fixed up because she had this accident in LA and they did a lot of plastic surgery on her. But it was a horrible accident where a teenage drunk driver hit her head on. It was before airbags, and the steering wheel, unfortunately, damaged this part of her brain. And it was so severely damaged that it couldn't recover. I took the scans from her neurosurgeon to the library back in those days, and I walked with them, and I looked up everything I could in the medical school library about what these areas of the brain behind the forehead are responsible for. This family was falling apart. This daughter was in massive pain. And yet, the only thing that caused it was a car accident. What was this? And this area is not a big area, really. So what was going on? So I'm going to give you now 9 functions that emerge from these fibers here behind the forehead, these prefrontal fibers in the middle. What I want you to do is think about these functions as I label them for you, and whether there's any way that you think having these functions in a community, in an organization, maybe even in a society, is something that as public policy academicians you think might be interested in turning the academic side of this into practice. Because if you do believe that's true, what I'm going to tell you is that there is a way for us to create public policy positions that support the development of these middle prefrontal fibers. There is a way to do that. Now, Tim Ryan is a congressman. Do you know Tim Ryan? And he's very interested in bringing these public policy things. And I just got an email from him, and he asked me to review parts of his book. So I don't know what the book says yet, but apparently he's just written a book called The Mindful Nation, where he's talking about this idea of having people develop these regulatory functions. So here they are. You ready? Number 1, this area of the brain keeps the body regulated. The heart, the lungs, the intestines, it keeps it all coordinated and balanced. Body regulation, number 1. Number 2, your capacity to be with another human being and attune to what's going on in their subjective experience requires this area of the brain. It's what this mom lost. In fact, she lost all 9 of these things, so I will keep on saying that. But our relationships depend on attuned communication. That's number 2. Number 3, something called emotional balance, which means life has enough vitality because your emotions are revved up enough and you feel good, but not too revved up so it becomes chaotic, or too depleted so you're rigid. So this optimal balance of harmony, in science we call that emotional balance. That's number 3. This is straight out of brain science, straight from looking up what this area is responsible for. Number 4, something I made up this term because the scientific terms are too weird, but I just made up this term called response flexibility. It's what allows you to take an outside stimulus, make a buffer between the stimulus coming in and your impulse arising, and you put a buffer there. So you consider, I wonder what I should do. This is what I want to do. I feel like punching this person or shooting a gun or whatever, and I won't. So you all know the famous marshmallow study, right? You know, I forgot, I think it was someone at Stanford, or where was the guy? Where was he? It was yeah, I don't know if it's Zimbardo. I think it was a different guy related to Zimbardo, but maybe it was Zimbardo. I should find out who it is. But they basically took 3-year-olds and they said, here's a marshmallow, but if you wait 3 minutes, I'll come back and give you 5. You can take them home. And some kids could wait and some kids couldn't. Some kids could feel the impulse to eat the marshmallow and some kids couldn't. And when they studied them 25 years later, the ones who didn't eat the marshmallow were doing well in every area of their life, and the ones who ate it were doing poorly in every area of their life. Because they didn't have middle prefrontal capacities, and they apparently didn't try to develop them. All right, so that's called response flexibility. Number 5, fear modulation. If you've been scared and you want to reduce fear, you actually grow inhibitory fibers from this area down to the limbic amygdala, which carries out fear. That's number 5. Number 6, something called insight, which is where you have basically a mind-sight map of me. Who was I in the past? Who am I right now? Where do I want to go? It's basically the way you become the active author of your own story instead of just being a passive historian. Insight. This area. Number 7, empathy. Compared to attuned communication, which you feel with another person, very important. Empathy is more making a mind-sight map of you. I imagine what it's like to be in your mental shoes, seeing from your perspective, knowing you have a subjective core. Mind-sight map of you. Number 8 is morality. Morality can be thought of as how we think about the larger social good, and not only having a moral imagination, but we actually have the capacity to have moral reasoning and moral enactment. It's a mind-sight map of we, where you realize you are a part of a larger whole. And there's a bigger picture than just what your brainstem impulses may want you to do, right? That's a mindset map of we. And the 9th function is intuition, which I'm using here in terms of the input from your intestines and your heart. Literally have neural net processors around the intestines and the heart. It's not just a poet's metaphor. You have a heart feeling and a gut feeling that are important, not always reliable, but important inputs to how you make decisions, right? And so that we're just going to call that intuition. Now, look at that list of 9, and while you're reflecting on the following question, think about, would you like to have those in your personal life? Let's just start there. I want you to, any of you have kids at home? Who has kids? All right, it's a mixed group, so we'll just try this out. How many of you have ever had your hot buttons pushed and you've lost 1, if not all 9 of those functions? So this is what happened to me. I was a research fellow. I had a young child at home, and I found myself flipping my lid. And this helped me understand what that was like when you actually lost those functions. So you can actually teach people to make a repair. This is the beautiful thing about it. So how many of you would like to have these in your life? Yeah? Yeah. And in fact, there's research that shows that if you do a mindful practice, which is a formal practice of learning to be open to what is and objective and observing and stuff like that, it's basically not the same as mindsight because mindfulness doesn't deal with integration, but it's the beginning of stabilizing the mind. If you do these mindfulness practices, you can actually develop all 9 of these middle prefrontal functions. Secure attachment promotes the first 8. Intuition has just never been studied. Therapists want to have those first 9. They want to have all 9. And amazingly, when you talk to people in various wisdom traditions, the Lakota tradition, the Inuit tribe, the Polynesian tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Catholic tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Jewish tradition, they all talk about these 9 functions. It's kind of amazing. Now watch this, and then I'm going to stop my talk. Put your hand together, right? Lift up your fingers and put them back down. We're talking about the middle prefrontal area as these middle 2 fingernails. What do you notice is unique about the physical location of this area of the brain? What is it? It's like real estate, location, location, location. What's unique about where those fibers are? Even there's not many of them. What are they doing? It's connecting everything, exactly. It's connecting the cortex with the differentiated area of the limbic zone, with the differentiated area of the brainstem, even with the differentiated area of the body And as we said, it makes mind-sight maps of you and we. So it's literally making maps of the neural input from other people. So that's the social, the somatic, the brainstem, the limbic, and the cortical are 5 differentiated areas of energy and information flow. And this area behind your forehead coordinates and balances all of them. So if I tell you that there's a practice to train your mind to strengthen the integrative fibers of the middle prefrontal cortex, which there is, wouldn't that be something that would interest you? And wouldn't that be something that if you run an organization, let's say like Google or Microsoft or any of the other places I've talked to, you say, well, hey, if this is where we're at in the science, why not make this a part of an internal education so that whether you're becoming someone in public policy or you're a teacher or a clinician or whatever you're doing in life, why not actually have internal education be a time where we make a new set of R's, where you have relationships, reflection, and resilience be the new way we approach basic education. Because here's the ultimate issue, for me anyway, when you want to summarize the whole thing, and then I'll close with this. What does it mean when integration in relationships and integration inside your body, the 2 locations of the mind, happens? You know what comes out? Integration made visible is kindness. It's kindness to the self, kindness to others, other people, kindness to the planet. If you start promoting integration by supporting people from the ground up in families, in communities, we can really change this world. It's doable, and together it's possible. So thank you very much for your attention. And it's good to be back. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, Deborah, do you want to take?
Did you have time for questions?
I have time, sure.
Okay, we have questions for Dr. First of all, thank you, that was fabulous. And
My pleasure.
for you to be here with us today was just phenomenal. Dan took time out of his schedule to spend time with us, so, and he did this as a favor to us and to the school. So, questions today for Dr. Siegel.
And you can call me Dan if you want.
Dan, okay.
Or
Questions
whatever
for
you
Dan.
feel comfortable with.
What questions do we have?
Yes.
Could you please explain more about intuition? Because I got in your book too, and I was confused that do you believe in intuition, or when you talk about intuition, you mean sometimes we feel we have to do it, but not necessarily our feelings correct?
Yeah, so the word intuition, I think your point, the question is, do I believe in intuition? And the inference, I think what you're saying is that some people use the word intuition for clairvoyant, for psychics who have an intuition. That's not at all how I'm using it. So I'm using it in a very different way. I'm using it purely in the sense of non-logical information processing that's intuitive reasoning that arises literally from the heart, and I'm not being metaphorical here, from the heart and from the intestines. There are parallel distributed processing nervous systems, which are basically like brains. There's a heart brain and there is an intestinal brain. And those inputs from the non-logical parts of our information processing, parallel distributed processing system, arise in an area called lamina 1, which is a layer of the spinal cord, move upward to a region called the insula, and deposit themselves in the middle prefrontal area. When you teach people to become aware of these inputs from the body, they suddenly get an intuitive way of knowing what to do with their lives, what kind of career paths to take, how to treat people, if something doesn't feel right about an interaction happening. For example, in that case you said, Deborah, someone might have the intuitive feeling, I shouldn't lie, and they would respect it. So unfortunately, we're never taught that in school, and most families don't teach it either. So you get people running around thinking that the major thing they're supposed to use is this logical, linear, primarily left brain way of doing things, whereas these intuitive things of the body go to another side of the brain. So integration honors both. It really honors both. And intuition, as we're pointing, is one of the 9 major functions that arises from this integrative thing. I've talked to psychics who see the word intuition, they get all excited, and they try to tell me that they can see the future and all this stuff, and they might be absolutely right. I have no idea, but I'm not using the word in that way, and I have no idea what to say to them. I'm open to whatever they say, but it's not what I'm talking about. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, first off, I'm an undergraduate at SPPD, and
Oh, wonderful.
I'm also an undergraduate in the philosophy department, so just wanted to let you know how much I appreciated your talk.
Oh, great, great.
And,
Wonderful to have you here.
And my question, though, is that, well, you were talking about rigidity, and I feel like the ethic in medicine right now is with the treatment, the ethic of treatment is really inclined for in the pharmaceutical direction.
Yes.
And that seems to me like a form of rigidity, which is something that you talked about. So
I agree with you
what's
completely.
your, view on
Yes,
that?
you know, part of what we're talking about in approaching, let's say, the field of medicine is a kind of revolution in seeing what it means to be human. And it really does allow us to look at the power of mental life to transform things. And there are so many studies around now that show, you know, your attitude, your intention, your emotional life, your relational life, massively influence your physiology. So I think we're at a place where, you know, if you're not trained to think that way, and I've heard the most amazing statements from chairmen of departments where I say, well, wouldn't it be kind of cool if you could like bring this idea to, and they say, well, I spent my whole career never having a definition of mind. Why do I need to have one now? I said, did you really just say that? And they said, yeah. And the fact that they could think it would be really painful, the fact that they could think it was okay to say something like that is mind-boggling. But they don't think there's a mind, so it doesn't matter, I guess. So yes. So, you know, systems take a long time to change. And people like you who are devoted to studying this kind of thing and being open to the way things are going to be the ones who make a change in this world. So that leadership comes from the bottom up. You know, and this is going to be a collective effort. So, you know, my kids always ask me why I travel so much. And it's really about making contact like this, where you say, look, you know, this is not something that's going to come from the chairman of anything. You know, this is going to come literally from a grassroots effort where people realize, let's say in medicine, that it's just not right to train young students to go and be put in situations where they have no way to bolster their own heart and keep themselves strong. You know, that they're just thrown into that. It'd be like throwing someone in the ocean and saying, here, go do it. You know, why not teach them to swim? You know, so I think we can do it. And, you know, what I've been trying to do with interpersonal neurobiology, and I welcome you to join us, and we have, every month we have, you know, classes in Santa Monica, so if it fits with your schedule, come on down and contact me, and I'd love to have you be a part of the community. You know, what we're trying to do is really, literally have people grounded in the science. So in interpersonal neurobiology, I mean, I've been in charge of editing 24 textbooks that are purely science-based, tens of thousands of scientific references to support what I'm saying. So we now have a professional library, right? We have an annual conference that happens at UCLA that you're welcome to come to in March every year. It's an interpersonal neurobiology conference. We're really trying to say, let's bring all the sciences together, philosophy, contemplative practice, arts, let's bring everyone together and ask, what does it mean to be human and how we can improve our human family? That's what it's all about. And where it's about literally honoring the differences in all these different disciplines, but bringing everybody together. And so we're really want you to come join us, because this is only going to be a group effort, a collaborative effort. And I thank you for being here. Yes?
You focused on, you said, the genetic side of the development of the brain and how that has an impact, and then the environmental, or how they're raised and the experiences that they have. Does any of your research go into how potentially relatively healthy people, so genetically somewhat okay, and environmentally up to a major part of their life relatively okay, how an environment that they then go into can cause it maybe to even regress? And the example I give, since we're talking public policy, not knowing these people personally, but you take William Jefferson, the congressman from Louisiana, seemingly had the best life, making good decisions, graduate school, law school, you know, freezing hundreds of thousands of dollars of, you know, bribe money in his freezer in the basement. And then Congressman Cunningham from San Diego, a war veteran, just revealed, you know, in Southern California, respected, goes and gets, defense contractors to buy him houses and yachts and boats. These are both people who are incredibly accomplished, family-oriented, statesmen, so to speak, in their areas, who then were into a new environment, which was Congress, which was public policy development, and made some of the worst decisions of their lives. One would have assumed that they had developed these elements of their brain well over time, both from experience and from genetics. So did any of your research look into how these environments, could Congress potentially be the steering wheel to the forehead?
That's okay. You should ask that question to Tim Ryan. I think you should email him, and that would be great for you to ask what Tim's view of that is. I'm serious about that. First of all, it's a great question, and I don't have an answer to it. I can just join you in looking at the question. Let's just talk about the brain for a moment, because you're kind of starting there, which is a good place to start. The brain is a complex system, which means that it self-organizes in ways that adapts to the environment. And if it's not open to unfolding integrative states, and this is kind of complex in this book, I just finished writing this book called The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, which actually deals with this kind of thing. What happens is you can have different states of mind. So I'm just going to give you a hypothetical. If I'm supposed to be a really good person and liked by lots of people, I can develop a state of mind of pleasing other people. It's actually, there's a left brain dominant thing where I can figure out what I'm supposed to look like for everyone to like me. So I get into this school or that organization, or get elected to this or that or whatever. But at the same time, this same brain can have other states that feel like I never got what I needed in life or whatever, and I want to get this money and freeze it, and I want to do whatever. And there's a tension between the non-integrated states of I'm going to be super, super good and pleasing everyone, and another part of me, if you want to use it that way, literally a brain state of activation, that's all about this dark side, And it's absolutely normal for us to have many, many states. Normal development doesn't go to being a homogeneous self at all. We're always a multiplicity of selves, and in the brain that makes a lot of sense. You have these things called states of mind that coalesce around organizationally cohesive functions, but sometimes they don't integrate. So in the Mindsight book, you'll actually see this exact thing you're talking about with regard to a state of shame. So you'll see, I forgot what I use as his name, they're all made up names, real people, but made up names. In the state integration one, and there's another one, I can't remember which one it is. Yeah, I think it's the state one. You'll find this example of a guy where it's just like that. Absolutely successful in what he did, but when it came to another area of life, he was miserably unsuccessful. And he just could compartmentalize these ways of being, and what it reviews is the developmental understanding in the brain of how that happens. Now, I'm going to say something that may be a little outrageous, but it's just worth putting in your mind because it seems like you're deeply thinking about this. And I'm sad to say this, but I don't know if Congress makes people act like that, or if people are drawn to Congress who have this inner tension to please, and then it gets in a very complicated thing. When to please, you have to be a certain way always in public, so another part of you can't be doing that. And so I don't know if Congress pollutes people's minds versus positions of authority like that draw people who are fragile in certain ways. So I don't know. I don't know any of the studies of that. And I know Drew Weston has studied that, a psychologist at Emory, and recently wrote about Obama's whole thing. If you haven't seen it, the New York Times article saying what happened to Obama's passion is actually, it's a fascinating discussion of the brain, of temperament, of what our country needed as public policy that didn't happen. And Drew Weston's article is really it's just illuminating the sense of really thought-provoking. So thank you for the question. And now I need to tell you, I have attention excess disorder, so I could go on talking like this for hours. So I'm going to defer to Deborah, and I can take you tell me, Deborah, what you want to do.
What time, do we have time out of what? Okay, how about 2 more questions? Is that okay?
Yes, 1 and 2. Oh, 3. No, it's okay. There's not much difference between 2 and 3. 3, yes.
Well, I'm just curious if this has been an area you've studied at all. There's been quite a bit written about the idea of nature deficit disorder, and there's a field of biophilia, which gets into the whole inherent affinity human beings have towards the natural world.
Yes.
And how we feel better in the natural world, and breaks it all down into various components. And I'm interested, you talked about the mind being in the body and in relationships, and how do you put nature
Yes,
and
great
natural
question.
into that?
So David Rock and I, David Rock is in the neuro leadership world, and David Rock and I created this thing called the Healthy Mind Platter. And when the United States Department of Agriculture came out with their new food plate instead of the food pyramid, we decided to come up with a food mind platter. And basically it tells people what you need to do to keep your mind healthy. So on that platter, there's time in, which is basically these mindful practices of integrating your nervous system. There's sleep time, because sleep is really, really important. There's physical time, because if you can do it, aerobic exercise is very important to keep the brain optimally functioning and the mind doing well. There's downtime, just chilling out time. There's play time for having novelty and goofing around. There is, I'm getting to the one you're asking about in a moment, there's focus time, close paying of attention, which keeps the brain young too. And the seventh one is connecting time. Connecting time is connecting to people on the planet. And we put it right in there. So when I say relationships, I don't just mean people. I mean your relationship to Earth. And so the way I remember that is 3G, 2P. 3G means with generosity of heart, this kindness, with gratitude for being alive, and with giving back. That's the 3Gs. You give to people and the planet. And 3G, 2P just reminds you, it's like a policy you could have, that that's actually what creates a healthy life, is 3G, 2P. And so the P is not just people. And so the relational part of it is all about relating to the planet. I completely agree with you. And if you go to garrisoninstitute.org, you'll see a group that's been assembling a bunch of people about just this question about how can we change our relationship with the planet. And they had me do the keynote 3 times in a row now, and you'll actually see, for free, you can just watch the keynote I give, which talks to all these policy people about planetary policy, about how you can understand the brain to try to encourage exactly what you're saying. Very important point. So if you go to garrisoninstitute.org, you'll find that. Number 2. Yes?
Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel, for the gift that you brought to USC today.
Oh, my pleasure.
My individual dream for many years, and I'm sure that in dreams of many that's sitting here.
Oh,
So
thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to ask a question that is very scary for me to ask in school of public policy and planning, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I was hearing it from the background of what you were saying, but I would like to know what is your take, what's your stand about soul, individual soul, and universal soul in everything that you do and in your business?
Yeah. It's a good question about the word soul, S-O-U-L. When I had that woman who had that terrible car accident alone in the room when her kids were out in the waiting room, and I said, you know, what is life like for you since you had this injury? I will never in my whole life forget what she said. She looked to me straight in the eye and she said, well, I guess if I had to put a word to it, I would say I've lost my soul. And for her, she didn't have a religious background. It was the essence of who she was. For her kids, that's why they were having so much trouble, is the essence of their mother was gone. I was doing work with a fellow named John O'Donohue, who was a former Catholic priest and a mystic and a philosopher. Unfortunately, he died recently, but we were writing a book together about this very subject, about the soul. Because as a Catholic priest, of course, you know, for him it's just natural to talk about it. And after he died, the family asked me to run his memorial for North America. He's was a prominent figure in the literary world. So I ran the memorial for him. And what I did was, because I, as a scientist, I didn't know how to address the part John was going to play in our book. So I can't answer you either. I'm open to all that stuff. I do think energy and information flow patterns gets us much closer to what people have been trying to talk about as soul than just talking about the brain. So I think there's some bridging going on here. And I've met with people who've written a lot about the soul, one guy in particular, we were having dinner with his disciples. He's like a guru who's written major books on the soul. And there was a very noisy restaurant in San Francisco. And he says to me, Daniel, I said, yeah. He goes, you know what I'm reading? I said, what? He goes, I'm reading your book, The Developing Mind. I said, well, that's great. I'm reading your book on the soul. He goes, oh, that's wonderful. He goes, you know, everything you say in your book about the mind and the brain, it's everything I've ever said about the soul. Same thing. Well, his disciples heard that, even though the restaurant was really busy, and they got really agitated. And they said, no, you guys have got to disagree about something, because it was like a love fest we were having with each other. So I said, what were we going to disagree with? He goes, well, they pointed to him, they said, you must know that the soul doesn't need a brain, and you must think that, or the mind doesn't need a brain, and you must think the mind needs a brain. And he goes, of course the soul and the mind need a brain. And then I said, well, I'm not sure about that actually, and they got them very upset. So I'm open, and I do a lot of speaking with people in the religious fields. And one of my students actually just wrote a book about the New Testament from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view. And his view, in fact, it's called The Anatomy of the Soul, now that I think about it. His view is that integration is the heart of the soul. And when you think about energy and information patterns shared in the narratives we have, in our relationships with each other, relationships with the planet, it's really an interesting, intriguing way. And it was what John and I were trying to get at in our book that will never come out, about the soul. So I'm open to it. And I think we just have, as a scientist, I always have to say very grounded in science. But I'm completely open to talking about it. It's just we have to say what is scientifically talked about and what's not. So it's kind of in a different topical realm. Yeah, but thank you for that beautiful question. And number 3.
Thank you.
Yes.
In all of the works of yours and John Kivitz's that I've read, to look at how to actually go about enhancing or fostering mindsight, on a personal, individual level. I mean, you touched on this a bit in your talk, but I'm wondering what you think in terms of leadership and
Sure.
in creating buy-in. Is it possible for leaders and policymakers to buy into this without some sort of practice?
Doing it
of
themselves.
their own?
Right. Well, here's a couple of things you could do. I wrote a book called The Mindful Therapist, which people who are not therapists who've read it told me I misnamed it, that it should be called The Mindful Person. So this is actually a book that walks you through yourself how to create integration inside your own life. So this is a totally to-do book. It's like, the mindful brain was the science, the developing mind is extensive developmental science, parenting from the inside out is what you do as a parent for your own making sense process. This book is about how you walk it through step by step. So, I don't know if you need a formal mindfulness practice. I mean, certainly mindfulness practitioners would say you do. I've had people do this book and then do the Wheel of Awareness, which this book is all about. And when they see what the issue is, they kind of incorporate it into their way of living. So that's one way you can do it. If you want to see how to apply it with other people, of course, you can do the Mindsight book. And then there are these other books coming out. I mentioned about this pocket guide, which if you really just want like the spherical, this is nonlinear book, knowledge base. So this is a way of doing it yourself. Now, sometimes it's hard to do these things by yourself. So one of the reasons why at the Mindsight Institute, we're really trying to have a community established is that it's really about relationships with the planet, with people, with each other. And so even if you're doing this, I recommend that you find a community, and if you want to join our community, that's great, where we literally support each other in this journey. Because ultimately, really, it's about awakening the mind out of automatic pilot. And it's not an exaggeration now that we know about the telomerase to say that you actually increase the time of your life. You will have the time of your life, and why not do that? So that whether you're dealing with policy issues, or I go around and I do the Lynn lectures for the Komen campaign for the cure. There's so many realms of our lives that we need to do this as a collective effort. This isn't just one guy up here saying something to you. This is all of us embracing this, finding it for ourselves, and then finding a way to inspire other people to rewire their brains and their relationships. So thank you for the question.